Hi, this is the Watersheds at Work podcast brought to you by Tip of the Mitt Watershed Council. My name is Corey Alanis, and I'll be your host. For those of you not familiar with the Watershed Council, we are a nonprofit group in northern Michigan dedicated to protecting our pristine waters through education, research, and prevention. For anyone interested in learning more, helping, or donating, please check out our website or give us a call. In this episode, we will talk with our Watershed Management Coordinator, Lauren Dye, on watershed management plans and their effect on local communities and lakes. This will give us a closer look into the steps it takes to help implement change in a watershed, how people can have a voice in what they want on their lakes, rivers, or in the education experience for their kids, and how to connect what a community needs into tangible steps for what will be done. I hope you enjoy. All right, so who are you and what do you do for the Watershed Council?
So my name is Lauren Dye, and I am the Watershed Management Coordinator for Tip of the Mitt Watershed Council. My primary role with the Watershed Council currently is to write watershed management plans, which can take quite a large chunk of time to do because there really is so much involved with it.
So what all goes into the watershed?
So that's a very important thing to know when you're talking about these. So a watershed is an area of land that drains toward a receiving body of water. And the outline of a watershed can really be dependent on the terrain of the area that you're talking about. So basically gravity takes any water or snowmelt on the landscape and feeds it down into the nearest stream, lake, or river.
Okay. Do you know how many watersheds we work with in our service area?
Yeah, so in our service area we work primarily with the Elk River Chain of Lakes watershed, the Lake Charlevoix watershed, the Little Traverse Bay watershed, and the Sheboygan River watershed. Yeah. And so I should mention that all of our watersheds, while are very similar in a lot of ways, they are all still very unique to each other. Like the land use that makes up each watershed is a different percentage of what those practices are. The amount of agriculture activity could be different from one watershed to the next, and also like just development. Some of our lakes are a lot more developed than others, so they're all very unique, and so that's why it's really important to take a close look at what the potential impacts are.
Okay. And now, what is it that you're trying to account for or change with these watershed plans?
So all the activities that happen on a landscape can influence or impact our waters, usually in a negative way. So those different activities are, for our region specifically, non-point source pollution is the pollutant to our water bodies opposed to point source pollution. And so non-point source pollution is anything that you can't identify exactly where it's coming from. So it's not coming directly out of a pipe, but it's something that flows over the land and enters a water body. So the different things that we look at are agriculture, forestry, stormwater, shoreline and stream bank erosion or development, and then other, kind of development practices throughout the watershed.
Okay. Now, what is a watershed management plan, and why is that important?
So a watershed management plan is written for a specific water body. For example, I'll take Lake Charlevoix, and we basically do an inventory of that watershed, and we conduct resource inventories in the watershed to kind of assess where the biggest non-point source pollutant threats are. And we do that through a couple different ways. So there's different survey methods that we'll use for different types of non-point source pollution. So for things like agriculture and forestry, we're usually doing surveys like desktop analysis, looking at aerial imagery, and then we'll also go do some windshield surveys, as we call them. So we're basically driving around and looking at, different areas of agriculture or different forestry areas that we're aware of to kind of try to capture where those threats or where those areas of concern could be, where areas might be really contributing a lot of pollution. So whether we see like a lot of runoff, whether we see erosion, those types of things. And then we also collect additional water quality data as part of that to really assess what the health of that water is. And then we also do things like road stream crossing inventories, where we're looking at the health of a road stream crossing, essentially. We are assessing the culvert, so that's where water basically crosses from one side of the road to the other. Most of that water is pushed through a culvert that in most cases is undersized. And so we go and take a bunch of measurements that can tell us whether or not this is going to be an issue for fish passage, how much erosion or sediment it's contributing to the water body. So stream bank is a similar thing where we'll look at large stretches of river or the streams to assess where there's a lot of erosion sites. Again, we're trying to quantify the amount of sediment that's entering a system, so we need to get those pollutant loading estimates, which can be really tricky in our area because our waters are such high quality waters. So sometimes that's hard to quantify in estimating pollutant loadings for our water bodies. So we also would incorporate things like our shoreline surveys. So when we do those, like we've done them on all of our major lakes in our service area, that information helps capture where the areas of concern might be on a shoreline, where there might be a lot of erosion or hardening of the shoreline, where there's a lot of increased development, or where those really pristine areas are along the shoreline as well. With all the information that we capture in those resource inventories, it then feeds into the watershed management plan. So the plan itself has to hit on many different things. It has to characterize the watershed, so we have to know what water bodies are in that watershed, where those water bodies drain. We need to know where are the major cities and municipalities and identify those. General population, if there are any large areas of wetlands. That's all information that we want to capture in the plan, and that kind of paints a picture for people who maybe never have visited that watershed to know really what that watershed is like. And like I mentioned before, our watersheds are all really high quality. So sometimes we'll refer to our watershed management plans we write as watershed protection plans because we don't have any impaired waters within our service area. And hopefully it stays that way. So that's one aspect of it. And then, as I mentioned, those resource inventories and a lot of that water quality data is then synthesized into that report. So we collect it all, we analyze it, and that information helps us determine where those biggest threats are, the areas of concern. Like I mentioned before, we call those critical areas. These are areas in need of restoration or protection, essentially. So where we can really implement restoration projects that would help improve our waters. And then it also helps us identify where the priority areas are. So those are areas that should remain protected, essentially. These are really pristine areas like large tracts of wetlands, shorelines that haven't been developed. Like those are areas that we want to make sure remain that way because they do serve an important ecological function to the watershed, and it really should remain that way. So with all that information, we are then able to identify implementation steps. And these implementation steps are actual on-the-ground projects, I guess you could say, that would either show measurable water quality improvements or could help protect the watershed. And those are broken down into many different categories based on the information that we found. So that's practices that we can do to protect for agriculture, forestry, a shoreline and stream bank. And for example, a lot of our watershed management plans will identify being able to restore so many feet of shoreline within a certain lake. That is a specific implementation step that can be taken, that when we apply for grant funds, we can basically take that task out and develop a proposal so that we can actually achieve that project. And then a part of that as well, we identify partners that have said that they would be willing to help implement that project or partner on that project in some way. So When I'm talking about partners, we work with other organizations, many local governments, so townships, cities get involved, the county gets involved through most of our service area. I think we get really good representation from a local government. And then we also work with other nonprofits like the land conservancies, Huron Pines, lake associations, anyone that's doing work in the watershed. So anyone that's doing something to protect the waters is someone we consider a partner and do work closely with. We try to provide some sort of cost estimate and timeline for our partners and when this project should be implemented, so those higher priority areas would be a little bit higher on our timeline, and then those project estimates can be helpful when writing grant proposals too. And so it's important to note that the whole reason that we write these watershed management plans is so that we are eligible for 319 funding. And 319 funding is Section 319 of the Clean Water Act for non-point source pollution. So these watershed management plans have to be approved by both the state and EPA. And so when I was talking about all the criteria that we have to meet in terms of the watershed characterization and looking at water quality and these resource inventories, those are all things that the EPA and the state are looking for to make sure that we're checking out these boxes to make sure that we did our due diligence in actually assessing the watershed so that we fully understand what's going on in the watershed, what the threats are to the watershed, and what we can do to protect it. And something that I'm always keen to share with our partners is that while the watershed management plans makes us eligible for 319 funding specifically, it also helps us apply for a lot of other things within the watershed too. So it doesn't just have to be that 319 funding, but almost any funding that we could apply to our watershed, that management plan is helpful for. And I think that many of our partners utilize this as a really great way to be able to help show that we have worked together, because it pulls together so many partners, as a way to say that here's this comprehensive plan that we helped develop, that we're partnering, and we've identified like this specific task as something that we need to do. So when someone was writing a grant proposal, that can be really helpful. And a lot of times what I tell people is that funders really like to see the 3 Ps, which are partnerships, plans, and projects. And so this whole watershed management plan process does all of that because we have to bring all the partners to the table. We have to create this plan, and we have to be able to identify projects. It should also be important to share that some of those resource inventories that we use in those watershed management plans may not have been conducted by us. They may have been conducted by one of our partners. They may have been the lake associations. A lot of our lake associations fund our shoreline projects or our aquatic plant surveys. That information really helps us offset the cost of developing a watershed management plan. And same thing with like some of our road stream crossings, stream bank stuff, like we have partners. Little Traverse Bay Bands of Adawa Indians helps with some of those through other grant funds, and Huron Pines do as well. So when we can have our partners really help collect that data for us, it really does offset the project quite a bit and can be really helpful. Another thing to note is that these watershed management plans are written for an approximate 10-year time frame because, as you can imagine, a lot can change in 10 years, and it's really also hard to project really any further than 10 years. So at around the 10-year mark is when we will look to possibly be reconducting those surveys again. So going out and checking the road stream crossings again, doing another shoreline survey to help allow us to update that plan to make sure that it's still useful and functional and as up to date as it can be. So anytime that we can have our partners help feed into that and help us collect that information is really valuable.
Okay. It's nice to know that you have this plan set out. The point is you're trying to get these step-by-step ways to help find those areas that need protecting. And for a person in the community, that is a reason why they should care about the watershed plan because it is going towards that protection of what they want to preserve, especially if they're a lake homeowner. It's protecting the land around them, it's protecting their water source. So is there anything a person in the community can do to assist with protecting that?
Yeah, so when we develop these plans, we at the Watershed Council have what we call watershed advisory committees for all of our major watersheds. And these committees help us develop that watershed management plan because the partners within the watershed really help us identify areas that we need to be looking at. For example, when we do our forestry inventories, we connect with the state to ask about their forestry practices and where they're currently active. We work with the lake associations to help determine, they helped us, of course, fund sometimes some of these shoreline surveys and stuff like that. The information is really helpful. So a lot of local government officials attend these meetings as well to kind of help us because policy really is also a very large part to this as well in terms of protecting our waters. So these watershed advisory committees are made up of anyone that's within that watershed that's either doing work to protect the watershed or is just interested in what's going on. And each watershed has a little bit of a different schedule on how often we meet. But if anyone in the community is interested in what's going on with that within the watershed, they're more than welcome to attend those meetings to help find out what's going on. And if there are ways that they want to get involved, that's also a good thing to attend as well.
Yeah, that makes sense. So for the Watershed Advisory Committee, anybody can be a part of that committee, or do people elect someone to then represent what they want done?
So some of our partners do that where they basically identify one person as someone who will attend that meeting, but I encourage anyone that is interested and wants to attend to be able to do that because it's always great to have more people at the table when you can, especially when we're protecting such a large area. And while the name may imply that it sounds a little bit more official, advisory committee, it is something, the typical structure of these meetings is where I try to bring in some sort of presentation that is relevant to the watershed or the work that we are doing or one of our partners is doing to really make sure that we're highlighting the partnerships and the work that's getting done.
Yeah, so for the work that's being done in someone's watershed, not only for the person to have a voice to let you know or the committee know like on what they want to have heard, is it good for them to then learn what's all going on? Like it's kind of a two-way street, it seems like, for information.
Absolutely it is, yep. Great opportunity to learn and a great opportunity to share.
Perfect. I guess if a lake owner is concerned about a water body, why do they need to understand their watershed and what organizations are there to help and how can a homeowner get involved?
So if a lakefront property owner is interested in or concerned about their specific lake, it's always really important to understand how the watershed plays into the health of your lake. And sometimes I feel like there can be a little bit of a disconnect for those that live on the lake because some people want to think that all the problems are happening just in their lake or are unsure of why that's happening. For a lot of the work we do, we always stress the importance of knowing what's going on in the watershed because with having high quality waters, in most cases that's where, as I've said, our threats are coming from, the non-point source issues. So if anyone was interested in attending the Watershed Advisory Committees, again, that's a good opportunity to understand more about the watershed as well as the partners that are involved in being able to accomplish these projects and also protect the watershed. Here at the Watershed Council, that's our main mission, is to protect our waters, but we couldn't do that without our partners either. So it's important for everyone to understand that partners really help us accomplish our work as well.
And I feel like just in knowing what the partners are, those are the organizations that can help. Is there any way that you recommend people to get involved with other organizations like the township?
So I think what can be most useful is if the community wants to get involved is to, number one, be aware of what's going on in your watershed. Number two, knowing where you can make a difference. So like when we're pursuing different policy initiatives, we're doing so to protect our waters. And so understanding why we're doing that and what role that's going to play in protecting our environment will really be helpful in achieving that.
I guess if you didn't work at Tip of the Mitt Watershed, how would you get involved?
So I would say that everything that we do with the Watershed Council falls under watershed management.
Okay.
Everything we do feeds into that. So policy is a very important part to protecting our waters. Restoration is very important to protecting our waters. Education is key to protecting our waters. So anything that you can do to help support the Watershed Council, so whether that's volunteer opportunities like our volunteer stream monitoring, for example, our volunteer lake monitoring, that information that our volunteers collect does feed into the watershed management plan. That's what helps us assess our waters. When we do other activities such as cleanups, you help keeping trash out of our waterways, plastics, and then also being aware of what policy issues are coming that you have the ability to vote on or give your input on by attending your township meetings or your county meetings. That can be helpful.
Yeah, the more you know, the more you can do. Any other things that you want to add on how do we protect the watershed?
So I think a lot of what we do at the Watershed Council is education, and I don't think I can say it enough when I say that being aware, being informed is the best way to protect our watershed, because if you don't know, you can't know how to protect it, you don't know what actions you can take. So just from an individual standpoint, just try to be aware and informed.
Yeah. Well, and so do you guys implement that into, I mean, obviously if you can get it at a young age when you're in school, that's, you know, where a lot of that education and passion comes from, because
Absolutely.
you're understanding what's going on. So is there anything that we do to help implement that with our watershed plans, or is that incorporated?
Yeah, so education is absolutely incorporated. Education is really critical. We definitely understand the importance of that. We have several youth education opportunities here at the Watershed Council. It's absolutely something that we've recognized as a need.
What implementations is there to help the youth understand, or what do we do to help educate them?
So as I mentioned before, everything that we do here is all that watershed management umbrella essentially, and while there are plenty of restoration projects we can do, we realize that our even greater impact to really be able to educate people. So we have youth education programs where we can try to engage youth when they're young and teach them about what a watershed is and what their impacts are from a very young age all the way up through high school. And something that I think shouldn't go unnoticed is the power of just being able to get out into your watershed and understand where you are. Say that, you know, you're going out on a hike somewhere, to really recognize, okay, where are you standing? And if, you know, a raindrop were to fall where you're standing, where would it end up? I think that's a really interesting perspective to take with youth and even adults. And I think that just that basic understanding can be really helpful in protecting our waters as well.
Yeah. I feel like if you were to take a group of kids and show them like a farm where there's manure that's dumping into the stream, going into the river, and making it non-swimmable, then
Right.
that's just like going to instantly connect for them compared to just reading it in a textbook. So being out there
Exactly.
and showing them hands-on what's going on.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. So can the community steer the education that they're giving their kids for the projects that they want to prioritize?
Yeah, I would say projects can be implemented. We outline projects that can be done by anyone. It doesn't have to be the Watershed Council. So it's absolutely and very much a community and regional plan that us and partners can use. So the activities that we outline in these watershed management plans could be taken up by anyone. Now, in terms of what you're going to do, you can choose too, like what water bodies you choose to focus on. Like while we identified those that are in those critical areas or those priority areas, doesn't necessarily mean that we shouldn't give attention to other areas as well. So if the community has other priorities or focuses that they want to address, they're absolutely welcome to.
Okay, perfect. So yeah, that's cool that the community can really steer that. Yeah, this is the voice of the people.
Yep, and again, like when we have our watershed advisory meetings, people can then bring their issues or concerns to those meetings as well. And hopefully we can either address them as a group, because maybe we don't have all the answers, but maybe one of our partners does. We can really help hopefully answer their questions, or maybe even help pursue funding or help whatever it may be to address their needs if we can.
Yeah. Well, and so besides just information, then it's networking too.
Yep.
With those other partners. It's
Right.
getting them tied to the people that they might not have known about or been able
Absolutely.
to reach about.
Exactly, yep.
Okay. What is it that you find challenging and engaging about these types of plans?
Well, the challenging part is that it is a really big undertaking, and so making sure that you have the time to accomplish the field work and really get the data synthesized in a timely manner can be quite tricky. But what I think is the most exciting thing about these plans is just what comes out of it, like the result of these plans. It's an incredibly useful tool, and once we have all this information, it's really exciting to see all that field work on paper, essentially, where you can actually look at a map and be able to identify where we saw high areas of erosion or where the worst road stream crossings are. You know, it's a really great visual for people that maybe are not as involved, but a great tool for those that are seeking to implement restoration or protection projects in the watershed.
Yeah. Is there certain assets of the watershed management plan that makes you eligible for state and federal funding for enhancement and protection?
Yeah, so I think I touched on this, that with an approved watershed management plan, we're eligible for 319 funding, but this plan can also be used for applying for just about any other funding source you can think of. We reference it quite a bit, I would say almost entirely, in a lot of our great reports to say that we've identified this as a priority project within the watershed management plan, and it really helps to carry some weight to be able to say that you have an approved plan.
So in every grant, do we mention the watershed management plan?
I would say just about, yeah.
Wow, okay. So
Yeah.
yeah, that is a lot of relying specifically on that information. So is there anything new or relevant that we've been working on with watershed management plans or that you have recently?
So currently we are wrapping up our first draft of the Mullet Lake, Lower Black, and Sheboygan Rivers watershed management plan. So that's part of the Sheboygan River watershed, but we've had to break that into 3 different watersheds because it is such a large one. So we are working on that one, and then we are also doing some updates to the Little Traverse Bay watershed and soon hopefully the Lake Charlevoix watershed. So we do have a lot of updating to do, but hopefully in the near future we will also get funding to be able to develop a watershed plan for the Black Lake watershed. And once we have that one complete, we will have all the watersheds within our service area covered under an approved watershed management plan, which will be really exciting.
Yeah, that'll be amazing. What are some of the highlights that you might want to let people know about that we're working on in those watershed management plans, such as Burt or Mullet?
So last year, or maybe it was the year before, we received a grant from the state, the 319 program, so the 319 Non-Point Pollution Program. We received a grant to implement several projects within the Burt Lake watershed. So back in 2016 or 2017, we got our Burt Lake watershed plan approved, and then just a couple years later, we got a grant for it. And so within that grant, we're doing a lot of different things. One is that we are repeating the shoreline survey on Burt Lake, which hadn't been done since 2009, so it was well overdue for an update. We're also conducting some outreach, so we're going to be, mailing that information to the Burt Lake watershed residents. We're also going to be reaching out to residents on Crooked and Pickerel Lakes and Douglas Lake to hopefully encourage them to participate in the Michigan Shoreline Stewards program. And as part of that, we're also going to be doing a Greenbelt cost share program where we're going to be working with homeowners to help them offset the cost of installing a greenbelt on their property. So we folded in some education, we folded in some inventorying, and we also are doing some actual restoration work. So it was a very large grant, and it's going to take us probably a couple years to implement. But like I said, all that stuff was identified in the watershed management plan. We were able to get that grant, and now we're actually going to get to implement it. And like I said, there's a lot in it, so it's very exciting that we're going to be able to accomplish all those things that we had intended to.
That's awesome. What is the stewardship program?
Michigan Shoreline Stewards is a website that we helped develop with the state, I believe. That's basically an educational website that explains the importance of protecting your shoreline and having a green belt or natural vegetation strip, explains how big it should be, what kind of plants you should put in there. And it's a really great website, and on that you can go on there and score your own shoreline. So you can take a little quiz and that asks you a series of questions about how wide is your lot, how deep is your green belt, do you have a green belt, and then it will give you a score at the end that gives you a grade essentially on your shoreline, which our shoreline survey kind of does, but this one will go a little bit more in depth, and then also follows up and provides you with a lot of educational information about how you can improve it. And so that's really what we're trying to get at. So with that shoreline survey, helps us identify where those problem areas are, and then hopefully by encouraging people to dig deeper into why it's important to have a natural shoreline, we can hopefully see some improvements when we do that shoreline survey again.
Yeah, And by helping them, it's keeping their waterfront from eroding away. I'm sure there's a lot of other benefits.
Exactly.
But also, if everybody did that in the community, that would give a whole analysis of the lake more in depth, correct?
Yeah, and so that's why we repeat our inventories, is because then we can see if there's any changes. So, and that's why these surveys that we do is to make sure that we're hopefully seeing some sort of positive change.
Yeah. So with the new BERT implementation plan, can anything on that be changed? Or is there any way that the community can still get their voice in even if it's already passed and we have the grant for it?
So that's a good question. So if you're referring to the Watershed Management Plan, we can generally add addendums to the plan. Like if there's anything that needs to be updated, like say something major happened on a shoreline, or all of a sudden all the road stream crossings went out. So yeah, well, we can always add information like that, or if we update any of the surveys for whatever reason, we can always add that like as an addendum to the plan. And in terms of like the community's input on like a grant funded project, that's, once we're awarded, there's not really anything that the community could provide input on necessarily. But that would be like the opportunity for someone in the community, like say they live on Burt Lake and do want to install a new greenbelt on their shoreline. That's an opportunity for them to reach out to us and get signed up for that program and implement a new greenbelt.
Yeah. And so for the Watershed Advisory Committee, is it better, do you think, to be in on that committee to voice what you want before the plan is actually fully made?
Yes. That's always helpful to have people earlier in the process to make sure that we're capturing everything on the front end.
Yeah, definitely. And also for whether if it's people who are members for us or members for, say, the Lakeshore Association, when these implementation steps are made, say for even doing green belts, is that something our members can do? Is that something the Lake Association members can physically do or help out with, like data research or doing bioengineering projects on their shorelines?
That's a good question. So we do tend to reach out to volunteers when it comes time to implement projects. For example, this summer we're going to be hosting some homeowner shoreline workshops, and as that we may be reaching out to volunteers that may be interested in sharing what their shoreline looks like as like a demonstration type thing.
Do members also collect data that is used in the implementation plans?
So for programs that we have established, like the volunteer lake monitoring or volunteer stream monitoring, that information will feed into the Watershed Management Plan as an overall assessment of the waters. But right now we do not have any other citizen science type programs where we would necessarily collect data from anyone, because as part of having a grant from Eagle to write a Watershed Management Plan, we have to have a QAP, which is a Quality Assurance Project Plan, which outlines exactly how we're going to do these inventories, how we're collecting that information, how we're going to assess that information, and that plan itself has to be approved by the state. So when we do include information that's not under an approved QAP, there's always like a little blurb about how this data was not collected under an approved QAP, because that is something that's important to like the state. So we generally wouldn't accept data that's just been collected by anyone.
Yeah. But if it's been by our direction, like the volunteer stream
Yes.
monitoring or a part that they're involved with
Yes.
through us, then that data can be used, and that's a way for people also to get out in the field and see what's going on in the watershed, but also have something that they're contributing.
Exactly. Yep. That's all. It all feeds into the same thing. And like our Watershed Academy, which is very similar to our volunteer stream monitoring program, that information can be used too. So it's very helpful for us to have our volunteers.
Yeah, definitely. So I guess just for the last part of this, what is the recap on the information that we just talked about and why it matters for the people in the community?
Okay. Watershed management plans are a very useful tool for not only us here at the Watershed Council, but also our partners and community members. Anyone that wants to know what's going on within the watershed and steps that they could take to improve their waters or protect their waters. This information that's gathered and synthesized in these plans is really helpful to give us a better understanding of what's going on in the watershed and what could possibly be impacting those waters specifically, be that a river, lake, or a stream. And that information can then also help us lead to even further questions that may require investigating too. So that information would all be identified in the plan that organizations can be able to pick up and hopefully be able to digest, and then if they're interested in pursuing a grant project on their own, of course, anyone is welcome to do that. We encourage you to share that information with the Watershed Advisory Committee to make sure that that's being achieved as effectively as possible.
Yeah. Did you just say that a person can go to try to get a grant themselves?
an organization that can go pursue a grant if they want. There's a lot of different grant opportunities out there, and some may be better fits than others. So if someone has like an idea in mind and wanted to bring that to like the committee, for example, that's a really good sounding board to be able to share that information, and then also find someone to possibly work with, or see if maybe someone could help apply on you or your organization's behalf.
Yeah, if you have people who are specific to writing grants, they're going to know all those little steps to take and can help those organizations. And I feel like the networking in that is so important. But this is great. Thank you so much, Lauren. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Corey.
Thanks for joining us for the Watersheds at Work podcast. Be sure to check out our next episode on April 20th, where we will dive into a 3-part series on septic systems with Caroline Keeson, who finished the Lake Charlevoix septic evaluation just last year. Caroline will provide in-depth details on why it is important to check your septic system, what problems can occur for a lake if they are not properly managed, what the results are from the survey, and what changes are being looked at in the near future to regulate these systems better to keep water safe and clean. There are a couple announcements we have to help you get involved with us and create a more clean environment. If you're interested in more of our content, check out our icebreakers. On April 19th, we will be featuring our water monitoring team here at the Watershed Council to share the results of the 2022 septic study conducted on Lake Charlevoix and discuss lessons learned about monitoring surface water and groundwater for leaky septic systems. We will also be featuring our Earth Day Bingo event, which started April 1st and goes until April 19th, where you will be able to win prizes by filling out squares with ways to help your environment. Check it out and join the fun. Lastly, on April 8th, there is a pod community event where residents may safely dispose of prescription or over-the-counter medicines and personal care products for free. This event will be happening from 9 a.m. to 1 p.m. at McLaren, Northern Michigan, Petoskey campus at the Hospital Circle Drive off Mitchell Street. To register or get more info for any of these, go to the events tab on our website. And if you're looking for more ways to get involved with us, check out our social media pages, become a volunteer, or make a donation to help keep our waters clean. If you ever have any questions, please feel free to send us an email at info@watershedcouncil.org.